What's a story from history that made you go, what the frick? Agnes MacDonald, wife of the first Canadian Prime Minister, travelled with her husband out west after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. She was really excited to see the country, but to her dismay she couldn't see much from inside the train because the steam from the engine blocked the view. Her solution? They tied a chair to the cow catcher on the front of the train and then tied her to the chair. She rode to British Columbia tied to the front of the train like a ship's figurehead. Good job the cow catcher wasn't needed to, catch any cows on that journey. There was a samurai who was actually worried about how obsolete their system had become, and now that samurais were no longer needed in Japan, he decided to go to Korea and insult them so much that they would kill him, and thus the rest samurais would avenge him by going to war with Korea and proving their worth. That sounds like a seriously cool movie plot. Some director actually has to make this. Xerxes I. He ordered to build a bridge across the Hellespont, and when it was nearly completed, a storm had destroyed the bridge. He got so pissed off that he ordered the soldiers to whip the sea 300 times for not complying with his plans. Apparently in ancient Egypt the pharaoh would rub one out into the Nile in a ritual to make sure the fields would be fertile. The military government of Myanmar built an entirely new capital in the middle of the jungle from scratch simply because their astrologer told them to. Crassus, a Roman politician, is said to be one of the richest people in history. He had a number of endeavors, but one was real estate. He didn't buy property in the conventional sense. He formed a fire department to serve the city. When a fire broke out, he rushed there and asked if he could buy the property for its value. The owner usually would agree, because while they would lose their home, the fire department would put out the fire and they would keep their possessions. If they didn't agree, he just stood there and watched it burn. Once everything was destroyed, he would offer again, at a pittance of the original price. At one point he owned 1/3 of the real estate in the city of Rome, in about 70 BC, when Rome was immensely wealthy. Then his head and hands were cut off and sent to Armenia to be used in a performance of Bacchae. Emperor Nero married a boy named Sporus whom he had castrated and present as a woman in public. It wasn't the first man Nero had married, but it's the first he'd made present as a woman. Nero had Sporus appear in public as his wife wearing the regalia that was customary for Roman empresses. Among other forms of address, Sporus was termed lady, empress, and mistress. Apparently Sporus bore a strong resemblance to Nero's wife Poppaea, who had died in childbirth, or he'd kicked her to death while pregnant. It's not proven either way, and he even called Sporus by that name. Poor old Sporus had a pretty crap life after Nero's death and married another man, a praetorian prefect who'd been a part of getting Nero killed. This man treated Sporus as a wife also and was killed when he thought he'd also try his hand at being emperor. But finally Sporus ended up with Otho, who was yet another emperor. Otho had been married to poor Poppaea before Nero forced their divorce, and Otho himself died violently after the Battle of Bedriacum. The victor of the battle, Vitellius, declared he intended to use Sporus as a victim in a public reenactment of the rape of Proserpina during a gladiator show. Sporus, no doubt sick of everyone's crap, committed suicide rather than face the public humiliation. My username is finally relevant, but it doesn't make me look good. At the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis, the marathon was a total mess. The first place finisher did most of the race in a car. The guy in second almost died from eating rat poison. And the fourth place finisher raced in dress pants and shoes, and took a nap by the side of the road for part of the race. The most WTF history fact I know. Messy as well as comic. The Olympics there coincided with their World's Fair, which had some new things debut that are still with us, like the first ice cream waffle cone, and also had a zoo full of exotic humans from afar and the famous Native American leader Geronimo. The Cadaver Synod. In 897, Pope Stephen VI exhumed the corpse of one of his predecessors, Pope Formosus, and put it on trial. He had a deacon stand behind the cadaver and move its mouth and talk for it while Stephen charged Formosus with becoming pope illegally. When Formosus was declared guilty, the papal vestments were stripped off his rotting body, his blessing fingers were cut off, and he was buried in a graveyard for foreigners. He was then dug up again and his body was thrown into the Tiber River. His body was retrieved from the river and a later pope nullified the Cadaver Synod, and he is now buried in St. Peter's basilica in his papal vestments. The cardinals who helped with the Cadaver Synod were excommunicated and they made a law that cadavers could not be put on trial. Then a later pope upheld Formosus' guilt and put a plaque on Stephen's tomb praising him for his Cadaver Synod. I wonder how wrecked the body looked by the end. Rather than use this power to rule or even conquer new lands, Nero still dreamed of being an artist, cheered by an adoring public. He played the lyre, wrote poetry and sang, but Romans considered the idea of an emperor performing on stage as the ultimate disgrace, demonstrating a disrespectful and scandalous lack of dignity. Nero either didn't care or craved the adulation too much. He forced people to watch his performances without letting them leave, which, Suetonius wrote, led some to pretend they had died so they would be carried out of the theater. Take horror stories told about Nero with a grain of salt. Most all of it came from his political rivals after he had died. Mansa Musa was the richest man in history. He went on a pilgrimage and was so generous with his gold along the way that he destroyed economies of cities he passed through for years after with hyperinflation. You forgot the best part. He wasn't actually giving it away so much as buying souvenirs at highly inflated prices. This guy literally destroyed economies with souvenir shopping. Caligula, Emperor of Rome. Sure, people know about him making his horse a senator, but another story is when he failed to invade Britain after not getting across the channel. Instead of admitting defeat, he chose his most British looking soldiers, marched them back in chains and paraded them through Rome as his spoils of war. It should also be noted that the horse story could very well have had a different meaning. Caligula could have been mocking the Senate. The Senate is so bad at their job. My horse could do a better job. The big thing in Victorian England was wallpaper which was dyed a certain shade of green. Green was considered to be a calming color, and this particular shade the most beautiful green in the world. It was used not only in wallpaper, but also to dye dresses, fake flowers for hats, and even confectionery. The dye was called Scheele's green, after its inventor. Its key ingredient? Arsenic. Yes, people were happily covering their walls in deadly poison, and quite a few people died as a result. Putting arsenic in wallpaper and other items was never banned by the government, it just fell out of fashion. It's possible this wallpaper killed Napoleon. He loved the color and had the wallpaper. The wallpaper would grow a particular kind of mold in moist climates which then gave off arsenic, which then may have killed Napoleon. He did have arsenic in his hair sample, but it might not have been what killed him. Dude named Jack Churchill and his exploits. Frickin' nutcase in France during World War II. Last man to successfully use a bow and sword in war. Would charge enemies playing the bagpipes. Absolute badass. One time took out multiple German guards with a bow by the light of their cigarettes. Jack Churchill, the man who got angry at the Americans for nuking Japan. Not because he opposed the bomb due to the humanitarian aspect. Oh no. He was angry at them because the Japanese surrendered and ended the war. If it wasn't for those dang Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. The man might have had a few loose screws, but holy crap, wasn't he awesome. This little excerpt from a story about a war between Maori tribes in New Zealand. When women and children attempted to flee the Pukerangira, they were mercilessly slaughtered and eaten. When the men emerged in a weakened state, many of them jumped over the cliff to avoid the Waikato warriors. The fugitives were tracked down and killed anyway. Te Weroero killed 150 prisoners with his favorite greenstone mere, only stopping when his arm swelled up from overuse. A greenstone mere is basically a club made of nephrite jade. I'm sure most are familiar with the execution of the Romanov family, the immediate family, with the Tsar and Tsarina and all the kids. However, they didn't stop there. They really tried to get rid of all the Romanovs, including a princess turned little nun who was thrown down a mine shaft, bombarded with grenades and eventually starved to death. In the 1500s, the Czech would travel all the way across the Alps to exhume papal Rome's bodies and then bring them back, dress them up in chic robes, then put on display in churches. The accompanying paintings are absolutely lurid and beautiful at the same time. The exhumed bodies are holy now. HMS Dreadnought was designed to be the most modern battleship of the time. they still decided to put a ram on it, as other ships in history would often ram each other, despite her guns being able to hit opponents at a much longer range than a ram would be useful at. She only sank one enemy vessel in World War I, a U-boat, which she rammed. It's the only time a battleship successfully destroyed an enemy submarine intentionally. Another little one, Admiral Hood was killed in a magazine explosion. Later, the HMS Hood was destroyed in a magazine explosion. Hay still decided to put a ram on it. The emperor would be proud. When construction of the Great Pyramids began 4,500 years ago, there were still woolly mammoths living on Wrangel Island, off the coast of Siberia. Although most woolly mammoths died out by 10,000 years ago, a small group of 500 to 1,000 survived there until 1650 BC. I always like the one that says Cleopatra is closer to us, in time, than the pyramids were to her. How the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, the cause of World War I and all the subsequent wars, was a result of bumbling assassins and a stupid stroke of luck. Long story short, after a failed attempt, one of the assassins, Princip, escapes to a restaurant to hide and eat in shame. Ferdinand was on his way to the hospital because his companions were injured in the explosive attempt. Ferdinand driver makes a turn down the wrong street and the car stalls right in front of Princip. Princip then fatally shoots Ferdinand. TLDR. A turn down the wrong street led to World War I. I mean, a lot of other things led to World War I as far as I know, but you are right. Japanese military sexual slavery victims from World War II. Women were kidnapped or tricked. Some thought they were to work in high-salary factories. Women from Korea, China, Thailand, Philippines, even some from Netherlands, Australia and so on. Women were raped, were forced to have unwanted hysterectomy. Histomony was done in the case of pregnancy. Fetuses were killed. One testimony say that the soldiers killed a girl and boiled the head, afterward forcing the others to drink the stuff. Testimony by Young Ok Soon, 1920-1998, RIP. One of the victims. Testimony by Moon Ok-soo, 1924-1997, RIP, said that she had to face 30-70 men each day. Another example of the violence is what happened on 1933-08-27. A soldier asked the victims menacingly, "Who here can do 100 solidars?" and all but 15 of them raised hands. Because the soldier had a sword, those 15 were killed. When one attempted an escape, they were tattooed. And there were tortures, force-feeding water and then jumping on the bloated body, or even hitting them with something like a bat with needles stuck onto it. There is a Statue of Peace all over the world: Berlin, Sydney, US, Georgia, San Francisco and many more. Those are made to remember these victims. They are brass statues of a girl with short hair sitting up straight. Please look up Unit 731 if you are curious of more violence. The men, women, children were experimented upon. Here are the examples. Putting a mother and a child in a very hot room floor and experimenting whether a mother would sit on a child if the temperature increased even more. Cutting off body parts to see how much it bleeds. Forcing a human into a centrifuge to dry a human out to death. Literally, putting them in 58 to see how long would it take to be frozen to death. Skinning them alive for skin samples. Testing flamethrower, collar on human. Raping, both for sick purposes and experimental. Only thing I can think of are two stories from a book I listened to recently on World War II, specifically from the Siege of Leningrad. One dealt with an elderly woman living in the city who became so maddened by hunger that when she could find no food in her apartment, she went to her cupboards, took every dish and other eating vessel in her home, and broke them on the floor, before scrounging through the debris in search of crumbs. The other involved young people, can't remember how old they were, who went out into the city in search of horse meat and witnessed a truck carrying a pile of bodies and body parts from the countless dead littering the streets, both from starvation and the German shelling. They heard a voice come from someone near the bottom of the pile. "I'm not dead, please help me," then the truck drove off. Meanwhile, a group of scientists and their families starved protecting their university's seed collection to preserve it for the future generations. They had to set up a buddy system to keep each others from riding the vault. When the German light cruiser Emden entered the harbor of Penang and sunk a Russian light cruiser, allegedly 89 crew members, but also 60 prostitutes died on the Russian ship. Oh, the Emden has a wonderful history of WTF moments. It's got to be the 10th BCT stand in the Battle of Yaltong Bridge. Basically 900 plus Filipino soldiers, cooks, medics and a chaplain were left abandoned against around 3,000 Chinese troops with propaganda proclaiming it to be 40,000. They weren't even forced out of the position at the end of the battle and actually led a successful counterattack to retrieve some of their forces before they were ordered to retreat. So yeah, what the frick? Imagine being the chaplain. One moment you're giving the battalion a morning ceremony. A few minutes later you're doming a Chinese conscript with your 1911. Another one would be the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, when the Russian Tsar was a massive Prussia boo and forfeited all of Russia's military advantages and gains against Prussia and sided with them. The Russians were so freaking close to winning the 7 Years' War. Like bruh, and it was all for a medal. When Ramesses II finally conquered this pesky nation, I am sorry I forgot. He enslaved 10,000 of their soldiers, had them castrated, and when he was buried had them buried with him. He really held a grudge against them. This reads like a Jeopardy question. I forgot which army, but the use of plague bodies in catapults thrown over some castle walls is the first use of bioweapons. Elizabeth Bathory was a countess from the 1600s who tortured, murdered a bunch of young girls and women and supposedly bathed in their blood because she believed it would give her eternal youth. Morbid Podcast has a great episode on her. Just listened to it the other day and I was fascinated. I forget her name, but some badass woman whom everyone was scared shitless of got an entire village to bring her 3 pigeons and 3 doves from each household. When she got the birds, her army tied bags with a flammable substance in them, lit them on fire, then all of the birds were released at once. Their nest acted as kindling and burned the entire village down. Olgov Kiev, I think. I can't remember the name of the country, but I once heard a story about a country where when they needed to know if something was a good idea they would consider it while being sober and while being drunk. That up until the mid-60s in the UK, you could go to prison for attempted murder if you tried to commit suicide. I only found this out recently. It made me go, what the frick. At the back of my mind at some point I believe the punishment was hanging. Go figure. Gonna go with the US. Almost going into a full-on year with the UK over a pig. The pig war was, effectively, a territorial dispute on a small island at the then edge of the American Empire in the 1850s. What ultimately sparked off hostilities was a UK man shooting a pig of an American settler on the island and the 2 forts nearby, one UK and one American, pretty much losing their ass over each other for no reason. In the end cooler heads prevailed, thankfully. But yeah, we almost had another war in the 1850s, 1859 if I remember correctly, over a pig and the money the pig would have brought the farmer, but in the end the pig. The primary problem with the pig was that the lines of the edge of the American and UK border were kind of poorly written at the time. She basically had stated that the line was down a river and this island was in the middle of said river. The issue of course being then it didn't state which side of the island that the line followed, which side of the island was still the river. In the end I believe the Germans were called in for arbitration and they eventually agreed that the Americans were in the right. No one ever knows what happened to the pig. In fact, it actually took so long to fix that the British and Americans both occupied forts on the island for some time, and in fact the northern British camp is still symbolically has the English flag raised and lowered on it by American personnel. I'm not actually sure if they're soldiers or not, making it the only place on American soil that is not an embassy where the English flag is still raised and lowered on a daily basis. But yeah, that is how a pig can start a war. That pope that put his predecessor's 8-month-old corpse on trial, convicted him of impersonating clergy among other things, and had it thrown in the river. Wow, read about this. It was a heck of a case. The accused was dead by the end it. Leopold II of Belgium killed an estimated 10 million people in the Congo. Natives were forced to work rubber and in many instances his soldiers would cut off the hands of any workers who didn't reach their targets. In some instances they would go as far as cutting hands off children, including infants, as punishment. All this without allegedly ever setting foot in the Congo. my aunts which were sent to residential schools in Canada said the girls wouldn't pee before bed. They'd hold it for when the priests would sneak into the rooms to rape them. If you peed your bed, the priests would move on to another child. Go to love Jesus. The residential school system sucked. The people who set the system up were misguided, and no oversight was kept over the people in charge of the individual schools, so abuses of power were rampant. Wasn't just Catholic schools either. Just about every denomination in Canada participated, though the Catholic schools did outnumber the rest. During the Armenian Genocide, a common killing tactic was to cram bundles of Armenians into caves and start a fire at the entrance. This works for the same reason that flamethrowers were used to clear pillboxes in World War II. The fire consumes oxygen, drawing from inside and outside the confined space, but the confined space has a limited supply of oxygen. If the fire burns long enough, the confined space is drained of oxygen. If you are in that confined space, you will die of carbon dioxide poisoning. The story of Fray Bentus. In World War I, a British tank crew got stuck in some mud where an artillery shell hit. The tank was completely stuck, and with the Germans and the British trying to destroy the tank, they held off for over 3 days before they had to crawl their trench with their Lewis guns. Andrew Jackson received a 2,000-pound chunk of cheese from Western Massachusetts that was displayed for a year at the White House. Then at Jackson's final party in the WH, people were allowed to carve off chunks to be consumed or carted away until a small chunk was saved for Jackson. This one is more personal. I have an ancestor, not sure exact relation, whose neighbor was beating my ancestor's kid. Ancestor proceeds to beat the heck out of the neighbor. In court, she was ordered to pay a $10 fine, which was a lot of money back then. Next time the neighbor beat on her kid, she marched down to the courthouse and slapped $10 on a counter. When asked what it was for, she said, "I'm going to go get my money's worth." Rape of Nanking. I won't go into detail, but a lot of the stuff they did was just shockingly sadistic and completely and utterly unnecessary to boot. This should be higher, much higher. The Japanese were ruthless. British intelligence. During World War II, stuffed dead rats with explosives and had agents drop them anywhere in Nazi-controlled buildings. This was under the belief that German soldiers or the janitorial staff would pick them up with a shovel and throw the carcasses into the building's furnace. This would then cause the furnace to blow up, and every time they saw a dead rat from that moment on, the Nazis would bring in a bomb squad. I heard that they actually did this once or twice and it worked, lol. Brigade Ross. Far-left terrorist group active in Italy in the 1970s-80s. Planned to kidnap centrist politician Aldo Moro. To kill his bodyguards, they hid guns in bags and dressed up as flight attendants waiting for their bus to the airport to avoid being sus while waiting for Moro's car to come to a junction. Their plan almost failed when an old lady stopped by asking them infos about some incoming flights. She left just minutes before the attack. Aldo Moro ended up getting kidnapped and killed. There was, I believe, a Viking. Don't know what his crime was, but he was executed by having his intestines tied to a tree and then having them slowly unravel as he was led around it. The Indonesian mass killings of 1965 to 1966. After a failed coup d'etat that the military successfully pinned on the Communist Party of Indonesia, there were months of unrest in which military, police, and civilians murdered over 500,000 Communist Party members, suspected communists, ethnic Chinese people, members of the feminist organization Jawani, and Javanese Abangan Muslims. The CIA took an active role in the killing, providing lists of suspected communists for the military to kill and later supporting the dictator Suharto in his rise to power. The killings are still not discussed in Indonesian history textbooks because of Suharto's intensive suppression of information. I think it was during the Opium Wars, but I'm not positive. A British commander sent the enemy a white flag with a note saying "use this when you surrender." Not sure if that's badass or what, but I think about it at least once a month. Recent history. Eric Prince. Blackwater. Prince shows up again facilitating Trump interests in the Ukraine. Then Prince's sister, Betsy DeVos, is named Secretary of Education. Interesting guy. Blackwater had contracts with the CIA when he was CEO, so he got involved in this kind of stuff during the Bush years. I think he sees himself as a sort of back-channel diplomat. Also, he's got connections to the Republican Party going back a long way. It was many years ago I saw this story in a history book, so it might be missing a few details, but basically there was a herb healer treating some patients in the Middle Ages. There was a woman with consumption and a soldier with a wound on his leg. He gave medicine to the woman that would help her and disinfected the soldier's wound and wrapped it up. An English doctor then walks in and declares that the herb healer has no idea what he is doing and cannot treat the patients. He takes a look at the woman and concludes something along the lines of her being possessed by the devil. He grabs knife and cuts across onto her forehead, and I think he took her brain out and rubbed salt onto her, just put salt onto it through the cut anyway. He says she's cured, but well, she's dead now. He then moves over to the soldier and decides for some reason that his leg is no good anymore and tells someone to bring the sharpest axe they can find. A little later the person returns with an axe and the doctor proceeds to lay the soldier's leg flat and then lifts up the axe and brings it down on the leg. Bone marrow flies all over the place and the soldier dies of shock. The doctor decides he's done a good job and cured his patients and takes his leave. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.